In today's story, we follow Emma Carter, a single mother, who is raising her son Lucas in a world where academic success is often seen as the only measure of a child's potential. But Lucas, a boy with a passion for robotics, feels overshadowed by others, especially his cousin Chloe, who excels in everything. As Emma faces the pressure of her family's expectations, she decides to take a bold step to show them the real talent and heart of her son. Join us today for a journey of love, empathy, and the profound lessons learned about what truly matters in life. Subscribe to our channel to start today's story. The morning light crept through the kitchen window, gently illuminating Emma Carter's tired face. She sat quietly at the table, a cup of coffee in her hands, her eyes fixed on the clock on the wall. It was nearly 7 in the morning, and there was no time to waste. With a soft sigh, she glanced upstairs, her mind already racing through the list of things she had to do before the day began. "Lucas, it's time to wake up," she called out in the direction of the second floor. "You're going to be late for school." There was no response. Not unusual. Lucas, her 10-year-old son, was often hard to rouse from sleep, especially when his mind had wandered into the world of robotics and machines. Emma could hear him tinkering late at night, his small workshop of spare parts and half-assembled robots scattered across his room. She had grown used to it over the years, even though she wished for a little more balance in his life. He was a bright child. Yes, but sometimes Emma wondered if his fascination with robots had become more of an escape from the world around him. She stood up, placing her mug carefully on the table, and made her way upstairs. The soft creak of the steps beneath her feet felt like a quiet rhythm she had come to know all too well. She opened the door to Lucas's room, and as expected, he was still asleep, wrapped in his blanket. His bed, a small corner of the room, was scattered with tools, wires, and parts of a robot he had clearly been working on late into the night. It wasn't the first time. "Lucas," Emma whispered softly, her voice gentle yet firm. "It's school time. You need to get up." Lucas stirred slightly, his brown eyes fluttering open. Though his expression was still clouded with sleep, Emma could see the worry in his gaze, the familiar trace of anxiety that seemed to follow him everywhere. "I have a math test today," he mumbled. Emma smiled softly, brushing a few strands of his messy hair away from his forehead. "We studied together yesterday. You'll do fine." "I know you will." Lucas nodded, though it wasn't the kind of nod that filled Emma with reassurance. It was a hesitant, quiet motion, one that told her everything she needed to know. Despite all of Emma's efforts, Lucas struggled with school, particularly in math. It was his greatest challenge, and often, it felt like a weight too heavy for him to bear. He was the kind of boy who didn't quite fit into the molds that others expected him to. His classmates had been unkind at times, calling him a slowpoke, or ignoring him altogether during recess. He spent most of his breaks alone, sitting in a quiet corner, either reading or sketching designs for new robots. Emma knew how much this hurt him, though he never spoke about it directly. For all her love and devotion to Lucas, being a single mother was much harder than Emma had imagined. 3 years had passed since her husband, Thomas, had died in that car accident, and each day felt like a new struggle. The grief had never fully gone away. But even in her darkest moments, Emma had pushed herself to keep going. For Lucas, for their little family, it wasn't easy, juggling work at the accounting firm and the constant effort of being both mother and father to Lucas. But she did it. She had to. There was no one else. After breakfast, Emma drove Lucas to school, her mind still preoccupied with his anxiety over the test. As they neared the school, she could see the weight of the world on his shoulders, his small body hunched under the weight of his backpack. Despite her reassurances, she knew that the fear of failure would always follow him, no matter how many times she told him he was capable. "Do your best, sweetheart," Emma encouraged him, trying to sound upbeat, though her heart was heavy with the same worry. Lucas managed a small, tight-lipped smile as he got out of the car and walked toward the school building. Emma watched him for a moment, her chest tightening. He was trying so hard. And yet, It never seemed to be enough. As she turned her car around and started heading to work, her phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed with her sister Sarah's name. Emma hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before answering. "Good morning, Sarah," Emma said, trying to sound more cheerful than she felt. "Emma, perfect timing." Sarah's voice was upbeat, a sharp contrast to Emma's somber mood. "I just wanted to confirm the details for Chloe's birthday party this Saturday. You and Lucas can come, right?" Emma paused, the familiar sense of unease creeping in. Gatherings with Sarah and her family always stirred complicated emotions. Chloe, Sarah's daughter, was the picture of success, an A+ student, a star athlete, and always praised for her achievements. In contrast, Lucas seemed to shrink next to her brilliance. Emma knew it wasn't intentional, but there was always that unspoken competition, that quiet, yet painful comparison between her son and her sister's child. It made her feel like an outsider in her own family. "Yes, of course, we'll be there," Emma replied, though her words felt empty. She could already sense the discomfort of the upcoming weekend. The party would be another reminder of just how different Lucas was from Chloe. Sarah had a way of discussing her daughter's accomplishments that made it impossible not to compare. Chloe won first place in the state math competition, she'd casually mention, and Emma would feel the sharp sting of her own child's struggles. "By the way, how's Lucas doing in school?" Sarah's voice cut through Emma's thoughts. Emma's stomach tightened at the question. "Well, he's doing his best in his own way," she said, choosing her words carefully. There was a brief pause before Sarah spoke again, her voice dripping with sympathy. "If Chloe can help him with anything, just let me know. She's always getting perfect scores. You know, just recently, she got another 100 on her math test." Emma's chest constricted, but she quickly masked her discomfort with a soft, polite response. "Thanks, but we're fine." She ended the call shortly after, her grip tightening around the steering wheel. It wasn't that Sarah meant any harm, but the constant comparisons, the casual reminders of Chloe's perfection, it was as if they were always digging at Emma's vulnerabilities. Always reminding her that no matter how hard she tried, Lucas wasn't good enough. The week passed in a blur of work and routine, but the upcoming Saturday lingered in Emma's thoughts. Chloe's birthday party was fast approaching, and with it, the inevitable sense of unease that always seemed to accompany family gatherings. Emma had tried to reassure herself that things would be different this time. That perhaps, just maybe, the family would start to see Lucas for who he really was. Not just through the narrow lens of school grades and test scores. But deep down, Emma knew better. The comparisons, the judgment, they were all too familiar. Saturday afternoon arrived, and Emma, despite the dread gnawing at her, found herself getting ready for the party. She carefully wrapped a present for Chloe, a set of science experiment kits she thought might appeal to her. Lucas, on the other hand, had barely stirred since breakfast. Lost in his thoughts, likely to be tinkering away in his room. Emma called out to him, urging him to get ready. He appeared at the door a few moments later, his hair mussed, his eyes still heavy with sleep. As they drove to the party, Emma could see how Lucas's nerves were getting the best of him. The towering houses in the Willow Creek Estates neighborhood felt so foreign, so out of reach for them. Sarah and her husband had built their life in the most affluent area of Cedar Rapids, surrounded by manicured lawns and pristine homes. It was a world that Emma, in her modest home and steady job at the accounting firm, had never quite belonged to. Lucas, however, seemed to be more affected by it than she was. His small face was pressed against the window, his wide eyes taking in the sight of the grand houses, the perfectly trimmed gardens, and the high-end cars parked in driveways. He was quiet, but Emma could tell that the contrast between his world and Chloe's was weighing on him. "It's really big," Lucas whispered, his voice barely above a breath as they pulled up to the front of Sarah's house. Emma smiled, trying to keep the mood light. "Yes, but remember, the size of a house doesn't measure the amount of happiness inside." The doorbell rang, and Sarah greeted them with her usual enthusiasm. dressed in an elegant dress. Her hair impeccably styled. She gave Emma a quick hug before turning to Lucas with a wide smile. Glad you could make it. Come on in. Inside, the party was already in full swing. Brightly colored balloons hung from the ceiling, and a large banner reading, "Happy Birthday Chloe," adorned the living room wall. Children were gathered in front of a gaming console, their laughter and shouts filling the room, while adults sipped champagne and chatted in the kitchen. Chloe, surrounded by her friends, was the center of attention, of course. It was her day, and everything about the celebration seemed to reinforce her image as the perfect child, intelligent, talented, and always so poised. Chloe's friends were playing games in the backyard, but as usual, Lucas retreated to the quietest corner of the room. Instead of joining the other children, he quietly sat by himself, pulling out a small electronic puzzle from his backpack. Emma couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness as she watched him. She had hoped, just once, that he would feel like he belonged, that he would find a friend, someone who would see beyond the quiet, withdrawn boy he often became in these settings. But it never happened. A voice interrupted her thoughts. It was her mother, Martha, who had approached Emma, a smile on her face as she looked around the house with approval. "Isn't this house amazing?" she said, her gaze lingering on the walls, the plush furniture, the carefully curated decor. "Sarah and James really have done well for themselves." Emma nodded, though her words were slow and measured. "Yes, it's lovely." Her mother, ever so observant, soon noticed Lucas sitting alone in the corner. "Why isn't Lucas playing with the other children?" she asked, her voice tinged with a note of disapproval. Emma shifted uncomfortably. "He's shy. He just needs a little time," she offered, trying to deflect the unspoken criticism. Martha didn't seem convinced. "Well, he should at least try to socialize. He'll never get anywhere if he just sits by himself all the time." Emma bit her lip, her fingers tightening around her glass. She knew that Martha's words, though spoken in a tone of concern, carried with them the weight of old expectations. Her family had always placed such high value on success, on achievement, and to them, Lucas's introversion and struggles with school were nothing more than shortcomings. As the party progressed, Emma could feel the tension building, the familiar pressure to meet the expectations her family had placed on her and her son. When dinner was served, and the family gathered around the table, Martha didn't waste any time in turning the conversation back to school. "So, Lucas," she began, her voice cutting through the chatter, "how did you do on your math test?" The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to Lucas. He sank deeper into his seat, his eyes fixed firmly on his plate. Emma felt her chest tighten, her heart aching for her son. But she forced herself to speak, her voice low but firm. "Lucas is trying his best," she said quietly, her fingers brushing against his hand beneath the table. Martha, however, wasn't satisfied. "Trying isn't enough," she said with a sigh, shaking her head. "You know, Chloe just got first place in the state math competition. That's the kind of excellence we should be aiming for." Emma's stomach twisted. She had heard the story about Chloe's success 100 times before. But it still stung. The comparison, the unspoken judgment. It felt like a slap in the face every time. She glanced at Lucas, who was now poking at his food, his shoulders hunched and his eyes downcast. Her heart ached for him, for the weight of the world that seemed to be crushing him every day. David, Emma's father, nodded in agreement. "Education is the most important thing in this family," he added, his voice filled with the gravitas of someone who had spent his life as a teacher. "It's the Watson family tradition." Lucas remained silent, his eyes fixed on his plate. Emma's gaze lingered on him for a moment, her heart breaking as she watched him shrink under the weight of their expectations. This was what he had to face every day. The constant pressure to be perfect, to excel, to be like Chloe. And yet, no one seemed to notice that Lucas's strengths lay elsewhere. She tried to change the subject, to bring the conversation back to something positive. But it didn't matter. Martha and David were too focused on grades, on achievements, They didn't see Lucas for who he truly was. The evening went on, but for Emma and Lucas, the celebratory mood had long since been shattered. The days following the party were filled with a heavy silence. Emma could feel the strain between her and her family growing, the rift widening as their expectations for Lucas continued to overshadow his true potential. The lingering discomfort of the birthday party still haunted her thoughts. And she knew it wasn't just the awkwardness of the event, it was the fact that no one had really seen Lucas for who he was. Her parents, her sister, they all seemed fixated on grades, on accomplishments, on what was measurable. But what about everything that wasn't? What about the quiet genius of her son? The way he could build machines from scraps. The way his mind worked in patterns no one else seemed to understand? Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing her son to a world that only valued one kind of success, the kind that was visible on a report card. Lucas had always been different. And in that difference, he had a kind of brilliance that no one could appreciate. That night, as she tucked him into bed, she promised herself that things would change. The world needed to know what Lucas could do, what he had accomplished. She couldn't let the pressure of academic achievement suffocate his spirit any longer. A week later, Emma made her decision. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when she sat down with Lucas in the living room. He had been working on another one of his robotic projects. His eyes focused intently on the parts in front of him. She had been watching him for a while, her heart swelling with pride as she saw the ease with which he pieced together the complicated mechanisms. This was where Lucas truly shined, in his quiet determination and his passion for creating things that could change the world. And it was time for the rest of the family to see that. Lucas, Emma began softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I want you to know something. You are amazing. You've been working so hard on these robots. And no one, not even your grandparents or Aunt Sarah, sees how incredible you really are. But I do, and I'm so proud of you. Lucas looked up at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. But Mom, I'm not good at math. I'm not like Chloe. I don't win trophies or get straight A's. Emma shook her head, her voice unwavering. No, you're not like Chloe. You're like Lucas. And that's more than enough. You don't need to be like anyone else. You've built something that no one else could even dream of. That's what matters. For the first time in a long while, Lucas looked at her with something other than doubt in his eyes. There was a flicker of something. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the beginning of understanding, that she hadn't seen in him before. He nodded slowly, as though her words were starting to sink in. Later that week, when Emma arrived at her parents' house for their usual Sunday dinner, she knew things were going to be different. She could feel the weight of their expectations hanging in the air. But she was ready. She had a plan. This time, she wouldn't back down. As the family sat around the table, the conversation naturally drifted back to school. As it always did, Emma could see her mother's eyes sharpening as she looked at Lucas, waiting for the inevitable question. And sure enough, it came. So, Lucas, Martha began, a smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. How was that math test? The question, though laced with a veneer of politeness, carried the same judgment as always. Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his shoulders slumping as he stared down at his plate. But this time, Emma was ready. Lucas didn't get the highest score in math. Mom, she said, her voice calm but firm. But he did something that no one here knows about. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward Emma. Martha frowned, clearly confused. What are you talking about? Emma didn't hesitate. She reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph, one that she had kept hidden for months. She placed it on the table in front of them, her eyes never leaving her family's faces. This is what Lucas has accomplished, she said, her voice rising with pride. This is a photo from the National Robotics Competition last fall. Lucas won first place in his division, out of more than 100 participants. The room was still. The silence stretched on as her parents stared at the photo, their expressions unreadable. Then, one by one, they looked at Lucas, their eyes wide with surprise. It was as though they were seeing him for the first time. Really seeing him. How did we not know about this? David asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Emma's eyes were steady, filled with quiet conviction. You never asked about Lucas beyond his grades. You've always been so focused on school performance that you missed the fact that he's been creating robots in his room for years. This is what he's passionate about. This is his talent. Lucas sat there, still and quiet, his hands resting in his lap. But Emma could see the pride growing in him. The sense of validation that he had longed for. He looked down at the photo. And for the first time, his face softened. There was a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Something shy but undeniably genuine. Lucas, Martha finally said, her voice soft and hesitant. This is incredible. I didn't know. I didn't tell you. Lucas replied quietly, looking up at her. I thought you wouldn't care. Emma's heart swelled as she heard his words. It wasn't just the revelation of Lucas's talent that moved her. It was the quiet understanding that had passed between them. This was the beginning of something new. Something better. She wasn't sure how her family would respond. But in that moment, she knew that Lucas had nothing to prove. He had already proven everything he needed to her. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in Emma's family began to shift. The weight of judgment, the constant comparisons to Chloe, seemed to dissolve in the wake of Lucas's revelation. For the first time, her parents saw him not as a disappointment, but as the bright, creative, and thoughtful child he truly was. They began to understand that success could take many forms. And Lucas's path wasn't meant to follow the traditional route of school grades alone. As the months went by, Lucas's confidence grew. He continued to develop his robots. His passion for engineering deepening with each project. Emma watched with pride as her son flourished, no longer burdened by the need to conform to expectations that didn't fit him. Even Chloe, who had once been the shining star of the family, began to see Lucas's worth beyond his test scores. One afternoon, she joined him at his workbench, eager to learn about his latest creation, a robot designed to help children with disabilities. It was a moment of true connection between the cousins, a bond forged in mutual respect and admiration for each other's unique strengths. As the family came to accept Lucas's different path, they also learned to embrace their own growth. Emma's relationship with her sister Sarah began to heal, and her parents recognized the importance of nurturing their grandchildren's individual talents. They had learned that love and empathy far outweighed academic achievements. At a family gathering not long after, they all stood together, gathered around Lucas's latest creation, a robot that would go on to help children in need. In that moment, Emma knew that her son's success wasn't just about trophies or grades. It was about staying true to himself, pursuing his passion, and finding acceptance and love in the family that mattered most. For more inspiring life stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel for new videos.